Hello again. In our last lecture, we looked at the ancient Nile Valley, at the kingdoms of ancient Egypt and Kush. These places were fascinating in many ways, not least in their religious life. An idea like divine kingship is a political idea, of course, at one level, but it's clearly a religious idea at another. Egyptian mythology, the concern with the afterlife, which is obviously associated with pyramid construction in both Egypt and Kush. At base, these are religious subjects. Religious questions are, of course, universal. And religion, or more broadly, the spiritual world and its relation to the mundane, have most certainly been a central concern for Africans past and present. Now, the object of this lecture is to provide a broad overview, an overview of indigenous sub-Saharan African religions and spiritual ideas, and the courses as well by which two great world religions, Christianity and Islam, have affected various parts of the continent. So again, an overview of religious and spiritual life. The themes of religious and spiritual change, and that of course means the history of these things, will reappear in more specific contexts in a number of succeeding lectures. The indigenous religions of sub-Saharan Africa were predominantly local religions. In other words, specific to particular peoples or ethnic groups, to particular places. There were certainly exceptions to that. A shrine or a cult, for instance, which could draw adherents from a wider region and become a regional shrine, attracting pilgrims perhaps from a wider area. But in general, the notion of a localized religious life holds. That means, of course, that we face the daunting task of trying to draw out commonalities from hundreds of different systems across the continent. It's always dangerous to generalize, but it's important enough to do so on this subject to try and to illustrate with some concrete examples. Now, like so much else about Africa, its religious life has sometimes been the stuff of Western stereotypes. In this case, that it's amounted to so much mumbo-jumbo. Even more sympathetic voices on Africa will use terms like fetishism or animism, which obscure, in my view, as much as they describe. I assure you, there's nothing simple about spiritual ideas in Africa. If anything, they are formidably complex. Okay, let's start at the top. Almost everywhere, we find a belief in a supreme being, in God, if you like. Olorun to the Yoruba of southwestern Nigeria. Mogai to the Kikuyu of central Kenya. Leza to the Tonga of southern Zambia. The Creator, he, or occasionally she, or he/she. The Creator is the ultimate source of the power, including moral power, we might say the soul force, if you like, that runs through everything. In West Africa in particular, we're likely to find a series of lesser gods, deities, associated with certain kinds of power, associated with thunder and lightning, for instance, or with iron. That's one indicator of just how precious iron was. In a lot of places, this was seen as a gift from above, as a gift from God, ultimately, and associated with a lesser deity. It was surrounded with ritual, often sacrifice, secrecy, etc., etc. Now, the deities in the Yoruba pantheon, again, of southwestern Nigeria, for instance, and the countless stories and myths about them, their feuds and their rivalries and their love affairs and the tricksters and so forth, will remind many of Greek and Roman cosmology. Stories or myths of the creation of humans, of humankind, by God are very common. The Kikuyu, again, of central Kenya, the Kikuyu tale of creation of the first people of their so-called tribe, bears resemblance, haunting resemblances in some cases, to the outline of the creation of humankind in the book of Genesis. According to Kenyatta's rendering of this in his ethnography, Facing Mount Kenya, the god of the Kikuyu, Mogai, establishes first the first male, whose name in fact is Kikuyu, puts him in a very attractive setting, an ideal setting, a sort of Garden of Eden, and of course eventually does the right thing and provides him a wife, Moombi. These two, Kikuyu and Moombi, are considered the two who begin the entire Kikuyu people. In many places in Africa, there are myriad earth spirits, that is connected usually with particular places, groves of trees, mountains, bodies of water, rivers or lakes. They can certainly affect these earth-related spirits, can certainly affect human events, especially in or around them. A couple of fictional references to these kinds of things in Ngugi wa Thiong'o's wonderful novel set in Kenya, in Kikuyu country in Kenya, The River Between. Early on, the old man, the father, takes the young man, the protagonist, to the sacred grove, and he explains to him that the young man actually didn't know this, but he carries the blood of a great prophet figure, and in a sense is going to carry on the work of that prophet figure, who, by the way, was a real historical figure in 19th century Kenya. The sacred grove is where that unfolds. Or in Chinua Achebe's novel of southeastern Nigeria, set among the Igbo people, there's a prominent role for the so-called oracle of the hills and the caves. And in fact, this oracle, that is a spirit that can speak to us through mediums or priests. This oracle renders judgment and, in effect, imposes a death sentence on one of the characters in that story. Now, ancestral spirits are particularly important. Western Christian missionaries found out very quickly that, they didn't need to explain the idea of life after death. This was a very old idea in the parts of Africa, all parts of Africa that they went to. Kenyatta's at some pains to say that ancestral spirits are not worshipped, although in a sense he may be drawing a fine line. They certainly need attention, and he calls it veneration. They need to be approached, supplicated. I suppose you could say prayed to. The ancestors are interested in you. They're interested that you behave in a moral fashion, and they can affect the course of human events, creating, in some cases, fortune or misfortune, especially for members of their descent line. Now, here again is where one of those building blocks, the notion of descent groups, makes a difference. In Tonga conceptions, for instance, in southern Zambia, the ancestral spirits of your matrilineal group, in other words, the members of that matrilineage who have come before those of us who are here now, can affect things, but they can especially affect things. The most direct effect they can have are on, in fact, the members of that descent group. Now, certain persons, and I mean living persons here, have the power to manipulate spiritual force, to direct it toward or indeed against others. The general word for this would be witchcraft. Now, diviners, on the other hand, are essentially charged with using various techniques to determine who is bewitching who, or spanning the barrier between the living and the dead, to determine which ancestor, for instance, is angry with your behavior and needs to have veneration or a sacrifice made in his or her honor, etc. Now, witchcraft and earth spirits have long histories in the Western world as well, of course. A glimpse at medieval European history. A look very briefly at New England and Salem, of course, demonstrates that. But, and here is my largest and doubtless my most dangerous generalization. In general, the belief that many kinds of spiritual power can directly affect human events, I will say, has lasted longer. Again, it has shown more staying power in Africa than at least in the Western world. In my view, it is simply folly. It's silly to ignore the idea that spiritual forces have widespread credibility in Africa. Now, this may or may not be diminishing, but it is relatively wider, the credibility that such forces would have, than in the recent history of the West, at least. And let me put this somewhat differently. People are relatively less likely, and I think have been less likely in the recent past, to attribute something, an event, a windfall. Somebody suddenly has a nice car and a lot of money. An illness, a death, are less likely to attribute that to chance. An accident, for instance. Was that chance? More likely to attribute it to spiritual power, perhaps wielded by living persons, perhaps not. Perhaps wielded by ancestral spirits or any of the other kinds of spiritual forces that I mentioned. Okay. Now, of course, over the last 2,000 years, there's been a great deal of religious change in Africa. A considerable amount of this has been occasioned by the spread of Christianity and Islam, or to put it a bit differently, perhaps some of this religious historical change has been prompted by the reactions and responses to the spread of Christianity and Islam. The faithful in both of these religions are so-called people of the book. That is, they accept that fundamental and universal truths are embodied in central written texts. Now, the notion of universal applicability, then, is one thing that separates this from the localized religions of Africa. The notion of evangelism on the part of the Yoruba religion, I don't think would occur to Yoruba. That's simply not the point of religious life, is to convert that to convert people to that particular faith. It obviously has been the point, at least at various periods in the history of Christianity and Islam. And again, this stems from the claim to universality of these faiths. Now, this imparts a greater potential for unity across places and cultures. By that I mean the notion that the central religious text and its universal applicability provides a potential for greater unity along and across much greater stretches of place and across many different cultures. However, we must quickly add that the briefest look at the history of Christianity or Islam shows that serious, and sometimes deadly serious, divisions have cropped up again and again within both, within Christianity and within Islam. So the potential for this unity of the faithful, of all of Christendom or all of the Islamic faithful, has often been an unrealized potential. Now, let's begin our overview of these two world religions in Africa with the older faith, which is Christianity. In the first centuries after Jesus of Nazareth's life, Christianity spread along both shores of the Mediterranean, and that meant that it included North Africa and Egypt. And of course, in the early centuries AD, some very influential Christian thinkers and writers, in fact, were based in North Africa. I think of Tertullian and perhaps above all, St. Augustine. In Egypt, there developed a particular strain of Christianity known as Coptic Christianity. And in the theological sense, to greatly oversimplify, Coptic Christianity adhered to a monophysite approach to the nature of Jesus. In other words, the Christ was not simultaneously human and divine, as held in Roman Catholic doctrine, etc., but actually solely divine. Monophysite Christianity, Coptic Christianity, became the predominant form of that faith in Old Egypt. From Egypt, Coptic Christianity spread southward. We looked in the last lecture at this long history of linkages in the ancient Pharaonic period, and now after the modern era begins, we see further linkages. From Egypt, Coptic Christianity spread in the 4th century to Ethiopia, which is the subject, as it turns out, of our next lecture. And there, the spread of Christianity would largely stop. I know there are exceptions to that, but it would largely stop for something like a millennium, something like 1,000 years. Partly it is true because of the dramatic and energetic Arab Muslim invasions of North Africa in the 7th century. Now, beginning in the late 1400s, European Christians begin to bring their initially Catholic faith, and in this case the Portuguese, begin to bring it to various points along the African littoral, the coastlines of West Africa, Central Africa, and eventually East Africa. The Portuguese made some notable conversions. Perhaps most famously, the king who came to be known as King, or Dom, the Portuguese for King Afonso, in the Kingdom of Congo in West Central Africa, who was proud for a time to call himself a Christian convert. But in general, the Portuguese missionary impact was quite limited. I would say the next great period of Christian expansion in Africa began in the 19th century with a revival of evangelism in Europe. And in some ways, it was symbolized by a figure like David Livingstone, who we know was, among other things, the first European to see Victoria Falls. He obviously didn't discover it since he was led to it, but he was a formidable explorer, but saw himself first and foremost as a missionary, though in his lifetime he apparently made the grand total of one convert to his faith. Now, it's worth noting that some of the most successful of the early 19th century missionaries in Africa were Africans themselves. This kind of contradicts the sort of Sunday school image of missionary activity, but it is nonetheless true. I could point to one example. Samuel Ajayi Crowther, who originally was indeed from the Yoruba region of southwestern Nigeria, what is today Nigeria, was a so-called recaptive. Somebody intended for him to be enslaved. He was put on a slave ship and began the transatlantic voyage. But it was in the mid-18th century, early to mid-18th century, and he was intercepted. The ship that he was on was intercepted by the British Navy. He was resettled, like others, in Freetown, Sierra Leone, where he converted to Christianity, and he ultimately returned to his native Yoruba country to spread the gospel, becoming, in fact, the first Anglican bishop of West Africa. Now, in the 20th century, of course, Christianity was associated with European colonial rule. Now, I don't want to oversimplify that connection. not all missionaries were in favor of colonialism. Certainly Livingstone was very divided on that question. And in fact, some of the abuses of colonialism were first brought to the attention of the outside world by quite devout Christian missionaries. But in the longer view, or in the wider view, it seems clear to say that the expansion of theology, or the expansion of a religious faith in this case, did coincide with the expansion of political empire. Now, most importantly, in some ways, almost all European Western-style education was run by missions. And when we look at the colonial period in the later portions of this course, that is a fact of terrific importance. Conversion certainly increased during the colonial period. But we should mention that it's also true that the numbers of independent churches which emerged also increased. And by independent, I mean bodies of people who certainly considered themselves to be Christians. They accepted the theological message, but they resented the control by the authority structures of the churches or missions, usually run by white Europeans, that they found themselves in. They broke away and organized their own independent Christian churches, sometimes called Ethiopianist churches, although there's no direct connection with Ethiopia. Let us turn then to Islam, perhaps the most thoroughly monotheistic of religions, and of course founded, as we all know, by the Prophet Muhammad in Arabia in the 7th century. In that century, Arabs began to spread the faith, and they spread it far and wide. Most importantly, for our purposes, right across North Africa, and as you know, for a time, into the southern parts of Europe and Spain. Now, it's funny, the phrase Christianity and commerce was a favorite of Livingstone's and of Livingstone's time. It became a kind of watchword for Christian evangelism in the 19th century. But in my view, there's in fact a more consistent connection between Islam and commerce. Islam came across the Sahara to the savanna belt of West Africa as part of the caravan commerce based on the domestication of camels. We will survey that and see the role of Islam in the West African savanna in Lecture 10. It came to the East African coast from Arabia and Persia as part of the whole development of Swahili commercial culture. These two regions, the West African savanna and the East African coast, remain today the most heavily Muslim, the most thoroughly Muslim parts of all of sub-Saharan Africa. Now, more than Christianity, just to enter a comparative note here, Islam has seen periods of fervent revivalist and purification movements within Africa, sometimes taking the form of jihad or holy war, and I would say particularly in the West African savanna in the 18th and 19th centuries. In South Africa, Islam has a presence as well, established a few centuries ago, but it came from a completely different direction. Islam came into Cape Town, into the Cape Colony, with Muslim slaves who were imported from Indonesia and Southeast Asia. And we'll look at that when we examine the foundation of the Cape Colony in Lecture 15. Okay, many millions of Africans then, hundreds of millions today, have been perfectly happy, indeed many of them quite proud, to call themselves Christians or Muslims. This is an historical fact of major importance. And yet I would enter a word of caution here. Conversion of a person or a group of persons or a whole community to one of these religions does not necessarily mean the rejection, it doesn't equal the erasure of older indigenous religious ideas. Those ideas, those religious thoughts, those religious practices can often coexist with the imposition, or I should say the importation, of the world faiths of Christianity and Islam. Sometimes it's not coexistence. In fact, I would say it's often not coexistence. It is in fact syncretism. And by syncretic religious practice, we mean the blending of different cultural traditions, in this case religious traditions, into a single practice or a single parameter. In David Robinson's wonderful new book called Muslim Societies in African History, he has 2 chapter titles that I think sum this up rather well. One is called The Islamization of Africa, and the very next following chapter is called The Africanization of Islam. They affected each other, and we find that syncretic nature not just in Islam, but very definitely in Christianity, affecting everything from the order of the service to the music to conceptions of spiritual power in myriad other ways. In fact, I think I can illustrate this from the southern Zambian region, the Tonga peoples with which I'm most familiar. I was there once on an occasion when the rains were late. This is seasonal savanna rainfall. The rain should start in November. They didn't. And we're getting into December, and as we mentioned in a previous lecture, if it waits much longer, there's real trouble because it's going to stop at the end of that season, and it might not be enough for crops to mature, etc. The people I was staying with went in the morning to the Malinde, to the rain shrine. This is certainly something much older and much more indigenous than Christianity. They went there, they carried out a particular kind of ritual. In this case, it involved the sacrifice of a black hen. There's a color association here of black hens. You sacrifice black hens when you want those dark rain clouds. On the other hand, if you're getting flooded out, you might go to the Malinde and sacrifice a white one in order to beseech Leza, the Tonga conception of God, to beseech the earth and sky spirits, to beseech ancestral spirits, to stop rain in that case. Now, the same people who did that in the morning went for an afternoon-long church service at their Seventh-day Adventist Christian church, and many prayers were offered there to a Christian conception of God for the same thing, for rain. Same people coexisting and syncretizing religious life. Now finally, and I'll end on this observation, and that is that both Christianity and Islam have seen dramatic growth since the end of colonial rule. Now, who would have predicted that? Maybe you could in the case of Islam. I certainly would not have in the case of Christianity. Why? Is the reason for this wave of newer conversions, contemporary conversions, is it a seeking after hope in a period of time, in a condition where the hopes of a new age, and by that new age I mean the advent of independent Africa, the hopes of that age being so often disappointed? Well, I can't answer that definitively. But I can say this. In any case, if we want to get any sort of grasp on African history and culture, we will ignore religion, past and present, at our peril. Thank you.